that.
Hi, can I be heard?
Yes.
Just to clear up, I do in fact consent to being recorded, emphatic, and also streamed emphatically. So, yeah. So if I say anything incriminating, that's on me. I'll take POIs in chat. Let me just turn on my camera so that you can also know that it's my face saying it. So when it's plastered on the news, I'm canceled a few years later. Yeah, my partner also Miko vetoed. Okay, for real, I'll take POIs in chat. Okay, starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. The world as it is today exists in degrees of bondage. That is, we recognize in the criminal justice system that you are mitigated to some degree of criminal liability when you have economic desperation, for example, or when you are doing pleas for insanity. But we arbitrarily don't do so for other perhaps equally pressing things, such as your socio-economic background more broadly, the neighborhood you grew up in, or your general situation in life. So broadly speaking, we think a criminal justice system that would recognize this and would broadly incorporate it into its sentencing procedures is one that is more just, more equitable, and more fair. Having said that, framing and setup, feasibility-wise, this probably won't substantially impede the justice system where a case takes years, or at least years longer than it already does. Just that's what we imagine to be more feasible. We think if every case took like 10 years, it wouldn't be feasible at all. Secondly, it's also feasibility to the degree where it's possible to quantify the mitigation percentage of an actual event on someone's life is. So for example, their background might have mitigated their choice in such a crime by 10%, 15%. Feasibility entails that it would be possible for us to quantify these things in the first place. Having said that then, argument number 1. In principle, this is just good and fair. The first claim we seek to make is that the easier your life is, the more agency you have over the actions you could have committed for 3 reasons. 1, your simple place in life determines how coerced you are into certain decisions. If you're relatively wealthy, then there are so many more safety nets available to you that you're not ever coerced into making a decision that could harm a human being, versus if you live a very difficult life that may force you to do things like choose between having to steal to eat. Secondly, the social environment that you're in says certain things are permissible while other things aren't. Poor people live in close proximity to gangs, often have more opportunities to be press ganged into conflict, press ganged into membership within these gangs, and are such more likely, simply statistically, to be forced into situations where they be available to commit crimes. And thirdly is that they're also more likely to be placed in situations where your mental faculties are frayed and chipped away, where slowly over time your attachment to the rule of law and your attachment to other people is degraded and chipped away as you are worn away by the indignities of life. These are the 3 things that may affect, quite crucially, your choice and agency when it comes to committing a crime. I'll then talk about why a significant portion of crime should be choice and why that should be a part of your sentencing, but before that, I'll take the point of clarification.
Yeah, so the info slide talks about like sentence can be infinitely mitigated. Can you just explain what that looks like on your side?
Yeah, if it shows that you have 0 choice at all whatsoever, then you don't go to jail for the crime. Like maybe you do some rehab. Or if you have total choice, then obviously you take the full crime. In any case, having said that, a significant portion of crime is mens rea. Now, currently, we punish crime for 3 reasons. A harm was done and we want to vindictively punish. Or secondly, we want to deter this person from doing it again. Or thirdly, we want to rehabilitate them to ensure that they become a better person when they leave. The harder your life is, that is, the more mitigatory your life circumstances are, the more your agency is impeded by definition and by construction. So the less effective years, so the more mitigatory circumstances are, the less effective further years in prison are as a method of deterrence if your choice was impeded from the very beginning, as the less relevant punishment is if they are less in control, as the less important vindictiveness is if they weren't actually the ones in control of committing the crime in the first place. As such, comparatively, the increase in mitigatory circumstances decreases the relative and requisite punishment we should be imposing on them. We already partially recognize this, and in some states, again, we already partially recognize economic desperation or insanity, but for some reason we arbitrarily lock out other things like the neighborhood that you grew up in, the family situation that you have, all of which contribute to the choices that you make. Principally then, we should implement this policy, 1, because it's more granular along the axis of choice. That is, it represents individuals more keenly along the axis of whether or not they actually committed the crime, and as such requisitely how much crime they should be taking the burden for. And secondly is that not doing so puts a double jeopardy, where if you are punished for a long time, but you are also facing these hard life circumstances that you were arbitrarily placed in, you are punished effectively twice for going through the same harm in your life. At the end of the first argument, a world where we implement this is more just, more fair, and more equitable. I'll take the clarification now. I won't take a POI later because there are 2 points of clarification. Go.
Yeah, sorry to be a bother. Does this mean you're getting rid of mitigating and aggravating factors as a construct then?
I mean, I guess, but that's just we're making it the entire justice system. Like it's all mitigation now. Anyway, secondly, reform. We envision two main kinds of reform. The first is reforms to the system by and large, and the second is reforms on the level of the individual's interaction with that system. First, we think that the system as a whole gets less punitive, more rehabilitative, and changes policing behavior. Why? There are many crimes that disproportionately affect the poor or minorities. Many of them are incredibly punitive, like, for example, marijuana, like the holding of marijuana, jaywalking, essentially being born in the wrong neighborhood and the wrong skin color. This can make you unable to provide for family for years to come, for simple possession of certain drugs or so on, due to things like the prison industrial complex. Why does this change on our side? The first is that the incredibly wealthy, whom would comparatively be facing far higher sentences than normal or in the status quo, are now afraid of getting these sentences when they end up getting caught. And as such, they have an incentive to negotiate a sentence to become much lower in the courts themselves. But secondly, is that states themselves are also comfortable in targeting these people to get free labor. That is to say, they're comfortable in racketing up the amounts of people within prisons for long periods of time because they can expect large amounts of poor people to provide free or effectively free labor for them in their prisons. Outcome-wise, we change the incentives that provide for the prison industrial complex in two key ways. The first is that while we cannot change the propensity of rich people to get caught, by increasing the potential punishment for these rich people, we increase the motivation for the lowering of overall sentencing and a shift towards more rehabilitative measures for those who have been alienated from society and thus subsequently have had comparatively less choice in their decisions. But moreover, we increase comparative deterrence for those who do understand but commit the crime anyway because they have comparatively less mitigatory circumstances and as such would face a higher burden of crime. As such, the deterrence is more effective for those who the deterrence would work on, and it's less effective for those whom it wouldn't work on, which is why we decrease deterrence for these people comparatively. Secondly, we also change the behavior of policing. We decrease the top-down incentives to over-police in ghetto neighborhoods since states, particularly states that use private prisons, are less likely to get a comparative return on interest and return on investment for the somewhat unlikely benefits that you get, for the reason that many people that they would press gang into prisons are now more likely to leave these prisons quite early, meaning that the actual return, the return of investment on things like increasing the sentences that the person would particularly have also goes down comparatively. This compounded with the previous incentive means that prisons by and large are comparatively more rehabilitative. We reduce overall recidivism and make people's lives better. The second is people's interaction with prisons. We think people are now easier to rehabilitate. By and large, people from poor socioeconomic backgrounds experience less years in prison, which means that you have more opportunities to get back into work, reducing the risk of recidivism by economic necessity, meaning that people are less forced to steal, less forced to opt into other crimes. Secondly, less years in prison also reduces the risk of alienation and entering into a society that is totally different to you and reduces gang presence inside these prisons by and large because the fact that there's less of an opportunity for these bad elements to accumulate and aggregate in the first place. By and large, then, for these individuals, they have comparatively more of a future because the lessened deterrence and the lessened punitiveness for many of these people whom recidivism is most likely to occur onto means that these people are comparatively more likely to have better rehabilitation, are less likely to reoffend, which means that not only are less crimes experienced by victims on the ground, which means that comparatively speaking, we also can spend less money on these people, can spend more money on actually making prisons good. We also have comparatively more resources to help the most vulnerable in our society. At the end of the speech, we do two very basic things. First is we envision a criminal justice system that is far more just, far more equal, and far more fair. And secondly, we create a world that is working towards one that is implementing a criminal justice system that is far better and far fairer. For these reasons, affirm.
I'd like to thank you very much for your speech, and now I'd like to call upon the first speaker for the opposition.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. I'll just set up my camera. Okay, I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the first thing I want to discuss is the principle, because beyond any effect opening opposition talks about, the purpose of the criminal justice system is to ensure that you can give people the punishment that is proportional to what they ought to deserve. The first thing I want to note is that they never respond to the principle of double punishment, i.e. you can never be punished doubly for the same crime. What we contend is that the initial punishment we were already giving, any addition to that has to be mitigated because they're already being punished by the life circumstances by which they live upon. So they are being punished by being born poor and being in the wrong neighborhood. They are being punished by being unable to make any kinds of friends outside of the gangs that they could possibly have grown up with. And because these other alternatives are impossible to ensure that you have any kind of mitigating factor for all possible life circumstances by which you go through, it is important to note that you cannot be born for the arbitrary circumstance of your birth, which you have very little choice on, that therefore ensures that this is a just policy to begin with. But secondly, they don't explain why utility does not correlate with agency. What we explain is that these are specific structures of a strong relationship, i.e. if you live a life where you are worried about your debt and your criminal record and losing your job and looking after your kids, it is incredibly easy to be put in a place of irrationality. It is incredibly easy to feel angry and commit a crime as a consequence. For the same reasons that you recognize things like crimes of passion, it is uncertain why this random and sudden burst of emotion is any meaningfully different from the regular basis of your constant emotional punishment, your constant feeling of anger and victimization against systems and states and the wealthy, and therefore push you to do crime as well. These are principally analogous as a consequence. I would make the contention, therefore, that it is incredibly difficult to make these arbitrary differences between your economic circumstance, which might justify things like you're stealing, but also significantly influence any other type of crime you might do, because you grew up in a neighborhood where potentially violence was the norm. You grew up in a neighborhood where people taught you these things were okay, and therefore it is impossible to believe that even if people make choices, which is why we're still punishing them to a degree, and these choices were entirely on their own, and that someone who was incredibly wealthy made the same exact thought process and choice as someone who was poor as a consequence. I don't think that is fair. Secondly, I want to talk about this idea that there is a floor, and therefore some people will reach a point where they will never be punished. I want to note this ridiculous in the sense that this would only happen insofar this person has absolutely no possible way to gain utility in their life, and therefore applies in a very small minority of cases. I mean, I will take the burden that people who are probably less well off are probably going to be punished a significantly lesser amount. What I would contend there is they might explain why these people will be punished, but they don't explain what the capacity for reform is. When David explains to you that because you are taken away from society, in addition to the incredibly difficult life circumstance that you go through, you're only further and further more likely to do crime. Firstly, for the same example that they give, if these low-income individuals feel victimized and targeted by the state because they're more likely to be caught for their crime, because people around them who are of the same race and social class are likely to be targeted in terms of the severity of their punishment, it is also incredibly likely they feel justified in their actions as a consequence of retaliation and therefore are more likely to commit these crimes to begin with. But secondly, the same crimes of desperation, even if the initial crime was not economic, are far more likely to accrue if you are taken 3 or 5 years or even 10 years and you're unable to work, you are unable to see your family, and therefore are more likely to have the same mental conditions one may need to do crime. Thirdly, I actually argue this will significantly improve conditions for the poor and lower income individuals. I'd make the argument that, insofar as wealthy individuals in status quo do not ever want to invest in these communities because they view them as crime-ridden, they view them all as criminals, and therefore they do not deserve any kind of taxation by the state, the only defense mechanism they have is to ensure you have hefty punishments for the people who end up doing these crimes, hefty policing in these areas. That will not work if they are left with incredibly light sentences, are unlikely to stay in prisons for a long time. And therefore, the only way to get the just punishment that they might feel these individuals deserve is to significantly improve the utility they might experience from their life. And as a consequence, it is far more likely increasing the amount of policing not only is not going to work because they have light sentences, or if they increase sentences, that's bad for the wealthy as well, because they're more likely to potentially incur the cost of that sentence insofar as they're not going to be left off the hook as easily. It's much more likely a response of being able to redistribute towards these communities, ensuring they are less likely to commit crime to begin with out of circumstance, and also receive a more proportional punishment, is the only possible mechanism for relatively wealthy or even middle income individuals to feel like they can possibly cure crime in these areas, as opposed to policing, because that's no longer going to be working. As a consequence of this, I'd make the argument that we significantly improve the lives of people who are most vulnerable in this debate. And know that, like, absent this policy, I would argue there's little to no incentive to do this, especially if the main incentive in which you could do this, i.e. over-policing, is likely to have a detrimental effect instead. I would argue these incentives flip and are much more likely to be dangerous on the opposition side of the House. Before I move on, is there a POI from closing opposition? If none, opening opposition, go ahead.
Okay, your point about double jeopardy doesn't make sense because being poor is not a punishment that A, the justice system is imposing you, nor is it a punishment for the crime you have actually committed, right? Why is this consequentialist approach you're taking the only and most important metric in this round?
One, it might not be what the justice system is giving you, but it is accounting for that and ensuring that you're not going to lay that on them again. But secondly, it is often because these are much more likely to push people to do crimes as a consequence. Lastly, I want to talk about prison reform. There are 3 reasons why conditions in prison are awful. Firstly, is just the facilities and actual conditions themselves. They are overpacked. There are abusive guards. There's likely to be a norm of violence and harassment that is unlikely to be stopped by these same guards. Secondly is a lack of rights, i.e. an inability to vote in many countries that have prisoners. Thirdly is a lot of punishments that are incredibly severe. The rich and wealthy do not fear because they'll never have to go through them and therefore are okay with them, i.e. the death penalty or the incredibly large mental torture that is laid on by solitary confinement. I'd make the argument that even the risk and potentiality that wealthy individuals who are a significant voting base, more so than individuals who are most likely to be targeted by the justice system, especially because they have the right to vote when they're out of prisons, but secondly have a significantly larger amount of capital to lobby governments, are more likely to attempt to improve these conditions out of the potential risk that they themselves or people they know and are close to them could potentially be put into severe forms of punishment. I'd make the argument, therefore, that it's far more likely you improve conditions for prisoners, rights for prisoners, and lay down incredibly abusive forms of punishment like solitary confinement and the death penalty that are likely to make mistakes, that are unlikely to ever work, and therefore do not increase the amount of punishment that is already more than necessary. In principle, this is just. I say this is the only way to ensure redistribution in many low-income communities, but thirdly, it's the only way to get any kind of meaningful political impetus for reform within the prison system. I'm very proud to propose.
I'd like to thank Speaker Orange for his speech, and now I'd like to call upon the second speaker for the opposition.
Alrighty,
please no recording This has been an extremely confusing debate, and I want to start by reading a section of the info slide. People who commit similar crimes are punished in a way that they experience the same utility over their whole lives. So, if I have a utility score of, let's say, 1,000 for my life, and I commit the same crime as someone who has utility score of, let's say, minus 500, well, we both stole a lollipop, but the justice system is in a bit of a predicament, because even if they give that person a very low potential sentence, the job of the justice system here is to put us into the same system of utility. There are 1,500 points of utility that have to be made up there. That means that people who commit fairly trivial crimes, even if they're not super privileged, but certainly more privileged than someone else who committed the crime, get punished in a way that is definitionally unfair. And the barometer we have for that is the rough sentencing guidelines that exist under the status quo. That is the first and most catastrophically obvious reason why this motion must fall, because opening government's mechanism for reform and the main benefit principally for the government side is itself definitionally illegitimate. Let's start with a few reasons why this is principally unjust. We're going to do the extra mile over opening opposition and give you the reasons why the status quo is comparatively equally or more just, rather than just attacking and lambasting opening government. Then I'm going to give you a much better mechanism and more realistic mechanism for reform as opposed to opening government. I've already given you one reason why this is an unjust policy, which I think is devastating. Let's give two more. The first is to say that this, per my POI to opening government, where they said that they would scrap other mitigating factors, means that they have to leave out, per the info slide itself, a series of relevant factors when it comes to the nature of the crime commissioned. The first is the likelihood of that person reoffending, which has been canvassed to some extent in this debate. The second is the degree of intent, meaning that someone who accidentally hits someone with a car versus someone who intentionally runs over them is necessarily treated differently. The third is things like whether a crime was racially or religiously or hate group motivated, because that is an aggravating factor that can no longer be considered. Things like the youth of that person or the fact that they listened to their community by a circle sentencing also cannot be considered. Therefore, by David's own metrics about proper punishment being properly observed, they themselves failed their test. The second thing I want to establish is that you also get disproportionately harsh punishments for people who've lived roughly privileged lives as per the thing that I described before. Noting that this is the very mechanism that opening government provides for their reform material, but it does not get delivered. Second prong of this first extension, why then do judges make worse decisions? The first thing to note is that judges start at a maximal threshold now, rather than a midpoint derived by a sentencing guideline, and then are forced to work down, which constructs an anchoring effect whereby the maximum is necessarily what you need to justify moving below the maximum, and that is the necessary burden of proof that is established as a de facto. This creates a series of problems. The first is that you have far more discretion advised. I contend that this debate does not mean that you automatically just have a sentence, that there is still some judicial discretion involved, and therefore this actually weakens and makes the mechanisms with respect to minorities worse, because where you have prejudiced judges, they're more likely to exercise that discretion poorly and have more power to exercise that discretion poorly because they are open to a far greater range. The second thing to say is that the evidence is extremely disconnected from judges, which means that they are required to make terrible weigh-ups, like was this person's abuse or was this person's absentee father worse, but also means that they're just unqualified to make those assessments, which means that procedurally you get more unjust outcomes. The final thing to say is that in general, you just get longer sentences for the reason that you have to justify moving down, which is extremely, extremely difficult. So the final thing to say here is, why is the status quo comparatively just? And this will get us up over opening opposition, who also contributes to this question. For a few reasons. The first is that increasing awareness of the harms to the state that both government teams identify, like for instance, the connection of incarceration to recidivism, means that states have pursued programs of therapeutic jurisprudence and are more likely and have already begun the path for instance, dismantling three strike laws, which closing government talks about. The second is that mitigating and aggravating factors capture almost all of what these government teams want to talk about, with only a few exceptions. The third thing to say is that there's hefty judicial discretion which can be applied correctly, i.e. by giving people lower sentences within the law without considering those specific factors because of the nature of who they are. The fourth thing to say is that you have access to appeals processes, which are far harder to justify in your world. The fifth thing is that you have the power of advocacy and awareness. And finally, defenses like mental illness, mental incapacitation, and automatism, like these government teams describe, also continue to exist. The significance of that is that this team can't just say we fix a problem, because they also create other problems. And what I've established there is not only more problems principally, but also a series of things that suggest that our world is better with respect to leading to fewer holes in the law. Let's now talk about reform, but before I do, I'll take opening government.
But the problem is that a lot of petty crimes in status quo are already overpunished, absent a significant number of privileged individuals wanting to lower that maximum unless they are affected to a greater proportionate degree.
Perfect. I'm going to engage with this right now, which is on reform. The starting point for this argument is to take opening government's own analysis, where they say the rich and powerful won't like this, so they will create reform. But this is a false link, and it's not actually properly proven. They never prove that they will do the reform that opening government points to. Why is this not the reform they'll do? 4 reasons. First, they still fear and dislike minorities on a personal level as politicians. Second, there are other reasons that opening government themselves point to, things like the interests in private prisons as an enterprise. Third, there's enormous backlash. Like, think about the white conservatives in a huge number of countries and the way that they would react in fear that immigrants and black people will freely steal from them. Noting that opening opposition flagged this argument, but not the public fear impact, meaning that there's also a separate impact here of the harm itself of increased things like vigilantism and fear. The final reason is that a series of these tools are already available, as closing government themselves talked about, like things like 3 strike laws. So what are they likely to do instead of the reform opening government points to? A few examples include massively defunding public defenders, changing the maximums and elements of certain crimes, i.e. taking crimes like marijuana possession and increasing them, taking cocaine and decreasing them, decreasing white-collar crime so that the maximum for an individual crime is lower depending upon your background. Third, things like predatory prosecution with respect to charge negotiation to bully poor and minority defenders into taking harsher punishments. And finally, things like police being more aggressive in their initial investigations and changing procedural rules. Why is this reform worse then? 2 reasons. First, it maintains 2 harmful perceptions. A, the perception that we've already helped the oppressed enough and destroys their political capital. And B, the perception of the group, as I've established, is already more harmful and prone to attack. But secondly, the wealthy and the powerful are more easily able to evade justice based on the very thing that opening government is trying to actually get rid of. Vote closing opposition.
I'd like to thank Speaker Orange for speech, and I'd like to call upon the last speaker for the government.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
3 things. 1, I prefer not to be recorded. I want to go to law school. We'll see what happens if this recording went out.